Thanks. So let me just start by thanking the organizers for the opportunity to speak at this forum and the invitation to visit this beautiful campus. I'll be talking about large-scale kernel methods. This is very recent joint work with my intern Jian Yang, Michael Mahoney at Stanford, and my colleague Haim Evron at IBM. Uh, so this is sort of a casual start to the talk. Uh, well, Gartner thinks big data is a hype, right? Everybody's doing it, nobody knows why. Uh, there is a lot of data out there in the industry, but I think the key burning question is when is big data going to be statistically valuable? When can you extract enough out of it so that you can monetize that data for practical business problems? And there is, because big data is such, big data issues are such so interdisciplinary in nature. I mean, you have statisticians, you have systems folks involved, numerical linear algebra folks involved. There is a difference in perception about what big data really is. So here's a question that I have been asking inside IBM. Suppose I give you XY pairs, X1, Y1. So this is a regression or a classification problem. N is 1 billion, so 1 billion samples, relatively high dimensional data, D is 1,000. And I just ask you the question, is this, so training a lasso model, you believe that only a few features are relevant, so you want to train a sparse model. Is this a big data problem or not? So the gut reaction when you encounter this problem is that you do a back of the envelope calculation. You figure that it's 8 terabytes of data. And the first thing that comes to mind is, well, I have a Hadoop cluster ready, I can run this, right? So this is, in some sense, the systems point of view, so platforms, systems to address big data needs. But then what happens in practice is that you build a model, it turns out the cluster model is running. In the meantime, you take a sample of the data, you run it on your laptop, you get some performance, you wait for a week, the cluster model completes, and you get some other performance number. And often what happens typically is that you don't get as much gain as you would expect, right? In some sense, this is disappointing, but in another sense, this is not surprising because a lot of the work, theoretical work in machine learning and statistics precisely says that if you make strong assumptions, such as linearity and sparsity, you can actually estimate parameters accurately. Your parameters may be low dimensional or they may be intrinsically low dimensional. In such situations, you can actually estimate these parameters with moderate amounts of data. You don't need big data, right? So what's the point of this exercise? I guess one point is that when you talk about big data, conversation is necessary between folks who do systems and people who think about statistical convergence. And the other point is that in big data settings, you should let the big data speak for itself. So make as few assumptions as possible, which relates to non-parametric inference. So I'm not going to define what that means, except to say that it's a broad area in statistics and machine learning where you use data to infer an unknown quantity while making as few assumptions as possible. And another name for this is infinite dimensional inference. So I'm going to be talking about various nonlinear modeling settings. So the running example you should keep in your mind is regression classification. On the left side is a classical sort of linear modeling setting where you're trying to optimize a sum of loss function evaluated over your training sample, plus some regularizer which has been added to avoid overfitting and encounter noise in the data. We'd like to actually replace the linear model with a nonlinear model, so optimize over a sufficiently rich family of nonlinear functions, the similar type of objective. As again, in like PCA, you're trying to maximize, find directions where the variance of the data is maximized, and this can be seen as sort of optimizing over linear functions, the variance of linear functions of the data. Instead of linear, we want to do nonlinear. We want to look at nonlinear models. So the theme of this talk is going to cross-cut various, the entire spectrum of machine learning. We want to go towards complex nonlinear models, let the data sort of speak for itself in a variety of settings. So here's the outline. I'd like to just briefly give you an overview of what kernel methods are about. I'd like to point out their scalability problems. Uh, and then look into a recent class of randomized algorithms that have emerged that offer, I think, very appealing solutions to be able to handle big data. When we think about big data and machine learning, the big data success stories are all about deep neural nets, deep learning, right? So I'd like to argue that kernel methods are also a viable alternative on well-recognized large-scale speech recognition tasks. And then this will motivate the need to make these randomized algorithms more efficient. And that will lead to some recent work that we have done around looking at the connection between these class of ideas and approximate integration techniques where quasi-Monte Carlo approaches are very effective. Okay. So you probably have seen this picture. Kernel methods, you start with a kernel function. You can think of it as a similarity function over your domain, which I'll donate by script X. In general, script X need not actually have any vector space structure on it. It can just be a collection of strings or DNA sequences. And you can think of the kernel function as a similarity measure. So it's a function that will take 2 arguments and return a number that denotes the similarity between the inputs. Kernel methods give you access to a feature space. So you start with some domain X here, and you map your data into a feature space, which has an inner product defined on it, where if you do standard linear modeling, it corresponds to building nonlinear models with respect to the original feature space. So this has this way of doing things has led to a whole suite of algorithms. So you have kernel ridge regression, kernel PCA, kernel CCA, kernelized version of a various a large body of linear statistical modeling techniques. So this is a slightly more abstract slide, but I'd still like to go through it because I think it's at the heart of what's going on with kernel methods, and it illustrates why these things are so central to the way we think about modeling, non-parametric modeling, and later big data modeling. So a kernel function gives you access to a nice function space HK. So I'll denote HK as a function space associated with the kernel K, and it has some inner product defined on it. And this is nice in the sense that the length of a function with respect to this, the norm defined by this inner product controls the behavior of the function everywhere. So stated in other words, if I give you 2 functions f and g from this nice function space, and I tell you that they are close in the distance derived from this inner product, then the function values everywhere are going to be close. And this is, while this might look like an innocuous property, this actually does not hold for many function spaces of interest, like square integrable functions, where 2 functions can basically be identical but may differ on measure 0 sets arbitrarily. So the point here is that these niceness properties, so a Hilbert space of functions, which is just a Euclidean space of functions with inner product defined on it, is called an RKHS. If there is a kernel such that if you take the kernel rooted at a point, it belongs to the space, and it acts as this as an evaluation. It acts as a delta function. If you take the inner product between the kernel and some function f, you'll recover f of x. And the important thing here is that RKHSs have this nice property, but all nice function spaces will also admit a kernel. So if you think of function spaces where functions have fast decay in their Fourier transform, then these will constitute an RKHS. If the derivatives are well behaved, then these will constitute an RKHS. So this is the reason why, in some sense, nice function spaces will be an RKHS. So what's the issue of scalability here? So let's go back to a regression-like setting. So trying to optimize over a nice hypothesis space of functions, which is an RKHS associated with a kernel K, some loss function. Think of this as squared loss or a hinge loss for SVM, plus some regularizer. So this norm here is controlling the complexity of the function. You want to find a function that explains the data but is not too complicated. So again, the nice feature about working with kernels is that even though this is an infinite dimensional optimization problem, the minimizer to this problem is actually a linear combination of kernels centered on the data points. So this turns into a finite dimensional problem. So you can plug these alpha i's back, plug this back into this objective function. It turns out that you then get nice linear algebra problems. of optimizing these coefficients alpha I. So if you have squared laws, you get this n by n linear system to solve. So this is nice. There are closed form solutions to doing this, but if you just stare at this, there is immediately a scalability concern, which is that this big matrix K is an n by n matrix, where n is the number of labeled samples. And for many choices of the kernel, this is going to be a dense matrix. So you'll have order n square storage. So forget about handling like even a million-sized data set, right? To be able to solve this problem, you'd need to invoke linear algebra tools, so you'll have cubic complexity there. That's too much time, training time. And practically, even if you spend a week to train this model, you have the bottleneck that at test time, when a new data point comes in, the prediction speed is very slow, because you have to access, to be able to compute this quantity, having learned your alpha i's, you would have to actually access all your training points. So this is extremely slow. On the other hand, if you look at linear kernels, then you're back to the linear modeling setting. And in that case, the scalability is, you can scale things much better, because you have, you're only storing at most like a d square covariance matrix or n by d data matrix. Training time is nd square, where d is the dimensionality of the data, n is the number of labeled samples. And test speed is also good. So linear methods are appealing for their scalability. So this motivates the need to try to find explicit feature maps. So I'd like to take my data x, and I'd like to find a feature map psi, so that I map this data point which lives in RD, so it's a d-dimensional object, to an s-dimensional object, such that inner products in that s-dimensional objects will mimic the behavior of the kernel. And if I can find this feature map, then I can go back to linear methods and I can scale things up. And now the complexity will depend on the number of features, the feature space in which this map embeds the data. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to focus on shift invariant kernels, and there'll be just some definitions here to set things up. So shift invariant kernels are those kernels that only depend, so k of x comma z implicitly only depends on the difference between x and z. So if you take your domain and you shift it, the kernel values don't change. This kernel is actually a positive definite function. What that means is if you take m data points and you evaluate this matrix, for any m, this matrix will be positive definite. So these are just some technical definitions to set things up. Now, just bear with me for a few slides. So the positive definite functions, so this is a classical theorem in functional analysis. It characterizes the class of positive definite functions. And it says that any positive definite function can be seen as the Fourier transform of some measure on RD, some non-negative measure on RD. So intuitively, the way you should think about this is, so if I take a finite set of vectors and I look at its non-negative linear combinations of that vector, it forms a cone, right? So this theorem is saying that if you take these complex exponential functions and you look at their non-negative combinations, that the space spans all possible positive definite functions. And the location of a specific positive definite function is defined by some non-negative weights that are used to combine these complex exponentials. So there is a correspondence between psi, a positive definite function, and a measure mu, which is just non-negative weights here. There's one-to-one correspondence. So what this means is if you scale your kernel, then this kernel is in one-to-one correspondence with a density p, and it has this integral representation. So the kernel is the integral. So kernel at x comma z is the integral of this exponential of x minus z transpose w, and then there is this density p. So there is an integral representation that mimics the kernel, and now what you can do is approximate this kernel by sampling this guy at a sequence of points, w1 through ws. So that gives you an approximation. And if you stare at this, this is actually the inner product between some feature maps. If you take s points, then this is an s-dimensional feature map, which is given right here. So this feature map takes a data point x, which is an RD, and it produces s complex numbers, which are given as follows. And if you take the inner product between the embedding of 2 points, then it mimics the kernel at hand. So there was a very nice technique proposed by Rahimi and Recht in 2007 where what they do is simply take these weights. These weights are simply drawn from the corresponding density P, and that defines a feature map. And now you can scale things up because you have a low-dimensional feature map that mimics the kernel. So the algorithm is as follows. Given a kernel, take its inverse Fourier transform, get the density P. So there's a correspondence between the kernel and the density. Then sample these weights from that density to get a matrix S. And now multiply X, which is the data matrix, against S. And here there is a connection to random projections technique that have become very popular in numerical linear algebra for accelerating things like the SVD. And further acceleration is also possible. And then you exponentiate this guy element-wise. And then you get a matrix Z, and you just simply run a linear method on this matrix Z, and you get scalable solvers for that, because the number of columns in Z is just S, which is a relatively small number. So this is a very nice technique, and since 2007, people have played with it. And so here's what has happened. So this is actually a collaboration with IBM Speech Group. So large-scale speech recognition. This is TIMID data set with 2 million samples. Recently, Jeff Hinton and 3 groups at Microsoft, IBM, and Google endorsed deep neural nets for their effectiveness in large-scale speech recognition. So if you take deep neural nets and run it, train it on this data set, which is a classical data set in speech, you get some accuracy, classification error rate. What's happened is that kernels, if you take standard kernel methods, they don't scale. So typically people sample the data and then run kernel methods, and you get this red line, which is a much worse error rate. And now with access to randomized methods, you can start scaling things up. But what happens is if you start, so on the x-axis here is the number of random features. So as you pump in more and more random features, the performance improves. And at some point, you say, well, there is a gap between neural nets and the kernel method, and that probably is because of depth. But I'd like to argue that that may not be the full story, because if you push these methods using different solvers that can handle larger number of random features, then it turns out that you can actually start matching the deep learning performance. In fact, at a reasonably large number of random features, if you turn the speech frame error rate to phoneme error rate, you actually can outperform the DNN. So this is promising in the sense that it reflects that using kernel methods and using standard numerical linear algebra convex optimization tools, you can actually go close to DNN performance. To make this happen, I just like to point out that if you explicitly materialize the matrix Z, which is 2 million by 400,000 random features, then this is actually going to be several terabytes, so you don't want to do that. So the research theme here is solving distributed convex optimization problems while not materializing these feature space matrices and working implicitly with the original data set, which is much smaller and can fit in memory. The other advantage is that there are very few parameters. In fact, because of the fact that the dimensionality S is relatively small, and because we're using iterative solvers as implicit regularization, and so we don't need to tune this lambda parameter. You can just set it at 0, and it still works fairly well. There are only a couple of parameters: the bandwidth of the kernel and the number of random features, which can be incrementally added. So it takes 20 hours on 72 cores, 40 minutes on an IBM Blue Gene machine, and it's comparable to DNN training. So on the other hand, 400K, I mean, the complexity of this solver depends on the number of random features. And to make things more efficient, we want to replace this way of doing things with something more efficient. And what we do is we look at, let's look at the fact that ultimately, sorry about that. Ultimately, the kernel is, this approach is driven and motivated by the fact that the kernel admits some integral representation. This is actually a Monte Carlo approximation. So this approach that I just talked about is a Monte Carlo approximation to this integral. Monte Carlo approaches are slow. So they would converge as 1 over square root s. So this means that if I increase my s, if I add 4 times the number of random features, which means 16 times the increased computational cost, then I'll only cut the error in half. So how can we make this error go down with a different choice of the sampling weights s? Instead of doing random sampling from the density, can we do something else? And the efficiency of approximate integration has been well studied in quasi-Monte Carlo literature, and I'll just give you some intuition as to what's happening there. So imagine that you have a function that you want to integrate over the unit square, and you would like to approximate the integral by samples on the square. So you can do 2 things. You can either sample uniformly, or you can use a QMC technique. So if you sample uniformly, you see this, there's a clustering clumping effect. There are regions of the domain where no point is sampled. There are regions of the domain where points tend to cluster together. And this is because the sampling is completely independent. When you sample a new point, it doesn't know, it's not aware of other points that have already been sampled. So in QMC techniques, you enforce more uniformity by sampling in a correlated fashion. Usually in QMC techniques, you have the integrand is sampled from at a coarse scale and then to a fine scale, leading to more efficient integration. So for instance, on just the line 0, 1, so this is a particular quasi-Monte Carlo sequence, you would actually start sampling the line in this fashion. So it's a non-trivial, the points being sampled kind of bounce non-trivially, but they give you a good coverage of the whole domain. Okay, so now in the QMC literature, the analysis of integration error really depends on how much the function varies over the domain and how uniform the sequence is where you're sampling the function. So there is a very nice result in the QMC literature that says that the integration error will be bounded by the discrepancy of the sequence where you're sampling your integrand times how much the function varies. So this discrepancy measure is called star discrepancy. It's actually measuring the difference between, so if you take a rectangle on the unit square, this rectangle has some area. What is the difference between this area and the fraction of points that actually reside in that rectangle? That's a measure of discrepancy, and then you take the maximum over all x. So this is a very nice measure and very nice result. Now, many QMC sequences actually match, give you discrepancy that is actually log s by d. So this convergence rate is actually much better than Monte Carlo convergence when s is large enough and d is not too big. Quasi-Monte Carlo sequences, MATLAB has tools to just use them as black boxes. So they'll give you a sequence of points where you can evaluate your function and do your integration more efficiently. So I'm just going to go quickly. If you use quasi-Monte Carlo approach, then the algorithm doesn't change much. It's basically the same, except that instead of sampling points from the density, you actually generate a low discrepancy sequence through a QMC black box, and then you do some transformations, and the rest of the steps remain the same. Does it work? So here's a comparison of the random Fourier features technique against QMC techniques, and you see that the relative approximation in the kernel is much better using Monte Carlo techniques. So this MC curve is the original random Fourier features technique, and the other plots here are through QMC techniques. So you get much better error rates. On the other hand, this leads to some question, why are some QMC sequences better than the others? And can we actually learn sequences that are more adapted to our problem domain? So for this, if we did an analysis of the integration error, where we looked at the family of integrands that we care about, and I'll just skip through these details for lack of time, but essentially you can bound the integration error in terms of a quantity that we call the box discrepancy. And what this box discrepancy does is, again, I'll just skip this for lack of time. This box discrepancy measures the uniformity of the sequence S as measured through a particular kernel, which is the sinc kernel, and it measures alignment with the density of the sequence. And this box discrepancy essentially can be computed in closed form for Gaussian density, and hence provides a mechanism to characterize the integration error for Gaussian kernel. And again, like so these theoretical developments actually do explain what we see in practice, which is that if you look at box discrepancy versus the number of samples, this plot actually mirrors the plot that we saw earlier, which is the integration error in practice actually follows the same order as the box discrepancy. So what you can also do is optimize the box discrepancy to learn a sequence that's adapted to the problem. So you can optimize this overall sequences, and that you can compute the gradient of these things and run and plug it into an optimization solver. And what we see is as the box discrepancy is minimized, so is the integration, so is the approximation to the kernel in some sense. So these sequences are more adapted to the problem. And again, like you can plot the integration error on the unit square, and you see that functions that are close to the origin are actually very close to being constant functions. They're approximated very well, but Monte Carlo approximations actually start to give very high integration error right outside the origin. While using classical QMC sequences, so this picture is better than the Monte Carlo picture because the integration error is smeared out a little bit more. And using adaptive QMC sequences, there is even better behavior of integration error. So this is the integration error is spread out quite nicely over the domain. But what you can also do is if your data actually lives in some sense near the origin, not the data, but shifted versions of the data, then you can use the QMC sequence, adaptive QMC technique to actually focus on where the data is. So you can have much lower integration error where the data is than otherwise. So I'm going to skip this as well, but this is simply saying if you take the kernel approximations, observations that we saw, and now actually look at regression performance or performance of a downstream task, then we see that the QMC techniques do give you better improvements over the classical random Fourier techniques, and adaptive QMC is even better, essentially. So let me just conclude here. The perspective here is the connection between kernels, integral representations, and the use of Monte Carlo QMC techniques to make things more efficient. And there are a whole list of, this is the first time a connection between QMC and kernels has been noted, and QMC literature has largely evolved in the number theory community, so it's very disparate communities and modes of thinking here that are being put together. But we'd like to do empirical analysis in various other domains and tasks, compare against other ways of scaling kernel methods. I think there's a very rich research agenda around developing specialized solvers for handling these feature matrices implicitly. So how to go beyond shift invariant kernels to other sorts of kernels more relevant to tasks at hand, and incorporating further data dependence in the way we do adaptive QMC, the way we learn these QMC sequences. So ultimately, I'd just like to convey that randomized methods offer quite an appealing way to tackle scalability problems in kernel methods. Why should we care? Because I think non-parametric modeling is central to extracting value from big data. And why kernel methods? Because it's mathematically very rich and it's very broad. And so it just seems like the right direction to pursue. So with that, thanks a lot. Yes. Yes.
I was once asked a question very similar with 100 people, an interview question.
Okay.
100 questions, 1,000, billion examples, how do you do it?
Yes.
And I found that was embarrassing to the interviewer.
What was embarrassing?
That they asked that question. You should never try to solve that kind of problem. It's the wrong thing. The other question I want to
So you're agreeing with me?
I'm completely agreeing. The other question, I did have a question though, which is, did you try the Quasi-Monte Carlo methods on the speech data set?
No, that's going to be done.